What up, YouTube? So we're gonna talk about Luke 16 today. I had a run-in and a discussion in the chat room about Zachariah and his wife, as written about in the book of Luke, and so the concept of sin. And I think it was an extremely good exchange. I think I learned something. Um, I don't think the people that I was in the discussion with learned anything, but I did, and um, I just want to talk about that. So in Luke 1 and 6 it said, and they were both righteous before God, walking in all commandments, ordinance, and of the Lord, and blameless. So I brought this up in the context of we were talking about sin and what is sin, and and I said that all people who don't sin, and they said, yeah, all people do, and I said, no, there are people in the Bible that hasn't sinned, and so they said, well, who? And I said, Zachariah and his wife, as written about, who are the parents of John the Baptist, because I was aware of that, and they said, well, no, that's wrong. So when I read it, they said, well, you're taking that out of context, you're wrong, blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to go over that to see, if I was actually wrong, what is sin? Whether, is there a way to, what is actually sin um, theologically, biblically, and, how does that play into our lives? And is there actually people that have not sinned? So in Luke 16, let's just say in context, it seemed good to me also, having a perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write unto thee in order, most excellent Theophilus, that thou mightest know the certainty of those things wherein thou hast been instructed. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of course of Abia, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all commandments and ordinances of the Lord, and blameless. They had no child, because that Elizabeth was barren, and they both were now well stricken in years, they were older. And it came to pass that while he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course, according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went up to the temple of the Lord. So he was a faithful priest, Zacharias and his wife, right? And they were held in high regard among the Israelite community, even throughout history, even after their death, because obviously they were the parents of John the Baptist. I believe they were the parents of John the Baptist, and they were considered close to God, and they had even, it was, said that they um, spoke with messengers of God. You see, so they were, considered very so-called holy figures in the Bible. So um, when I said, of course, they were not sinners, an argument ensued. They said they were sinners, and so I read the scripture. They said, you're stupid. That's not what this means. Now, was I wrong? Yes and no. So let's get an understanding of that, right? So I went to discuss this with AI, which is tricky, right? But just let's go over a couple of things I found in AI, right? On the concepts of these two in sin and etc., so I can get a better understanding, right? So let's read some of what it came up with, right, in reference to this. So I asked AI about that, and I said, so they told me I was wrong. So I asked AI, and it said, yes, based on the strictly literal meaning of the verse in isolation, you could conclude that they broke no law according to the record after the birth of their son and were not sinners. However, this interpretation creates a direct conflict with the rest of the biblical text and the details within the same chapter. So I said, basically, I'm asking you a yes or no question. And I said, so AI came back and said, I did say that yes, and I stand by it. However, that was only a part of the statement, right? Where he said, so I said, okay, let's proceed step by step. So AI agreed with me, right? It said that, yes, based on the strictly literal reading of the verse, one could conclude that they broke no law, right? So according to this verse in Luke 16, Zacharias and his wife were not considered sinners because sin is a breaking of the law. But sin is also has two aspects of original sin, and we're going to go over that. So that when I told them that sin, that Zachariah and his wife were not sinners, that is true. That is a true statement. That's biblically sound, right? And I verified this through AI, even though it was hard to get it to say yes. But it did. Eventually it said yes. Based on the strictly literal meaning of the verse, in isolation, one could conclude they broke no law according to the record after the birth of their son and were not sinners, right? Key word, and that's what I told them, that they were not sinners. It said, right? Based on the reading of the text, you could conclude that after the birth of John the Baptist, they were not considered sinners. So that is a fact, that when you read this, that's telling you that the parents of John the Baptist, Zacharias and his wife, were considered sinless or not sinners. So we all are not sinners, right? We can, that's a fact. And I verified that with AI. I got it to, and the reason I did that because I wanted a unemotional analysis of the text to show people that it wasn't me interpreting the text. It was simply a literal reading of the verse in isolation. And that me doing that was not me lying or misinterpreting or coming up with my own interpretation. So I use AI because AI can't come up with its own interpretation, right? So I wanted to get AI to, to kind of, with a laser focus go in on that and tell me what it thought, right? And it said, yes, based on the strictly literal reading of the verse, one could conclude they broke no law according to the record after the birth of their son and were not sinners. Now let's move on, right? I gotta get that a thumbs up, right? Okay, now I went on to discuss a little more. I wanted to get a unemotional, analysis, right? So I asked AI, would it be safe to say that sin is described in two forms, one as biblical law and one law as it is written? And so let me expound. Oops. The next question. What the? The next question would be: would it be safe to say that sin is described in two forms? One as biblical law, as it is written, sin is the breaking of the written laws of the Israelites, and the second would be the concept of inherited sin or original sin. It went on to say, yes, that is a very helpful and biblical sound way to understand sin. The distinction you're making is a core concept of Christian theology. You see? So when we look at this verse, we have to understand, right, the core concept of Christian theology and sin. So to say that John the Baptist and Zacharias, John the Baptist's father Zacharias and his mother Elizabeth were not sinners is a correct statement again, right? They were not sinners meaning they were not breakers of biblical law. That is a correct statement. If you say that, that's fine, right? That is 100% correct, right? But what you must understand is a nuanced approach. You see? So there's two forms of sin. There's the transgression of the law, right, which is biblical law, is a sin. John the Baptist's parents, Zacharias and Elizabeth, never broke broke the law after the birth of John the Baptist. You see? That's key. After the birth of John the Baptist, they made no infractions of the law. And were damn near perfect prior to that. The only mistake Zacharias made, he didn't believe Gabriel was an angel from God, which is incredible, right? And a messenger from God, and telling him that he was going to have a baby, and his wife was like, 60 years old. That was the only mistake he ever made. Obviously he repented from that and went on to be considered a man who never sinned, right? Under the law. He repented. He was punished for that, for not listening to the angel. He repented and then went on to be considered, after the birth of John the Baptist, as it is written, a man who was then without sin, him and his wife, right? So, and we see that the first form of transgression of biblical law is often referred to as actual sin or personal sin, when a person knowingly breaks one of the laws, right? But then there's also the inherited form of sin. The second form, the concept of inherited sin, called the original sin, right, isn't an act of breaking the law. It is considered it's a theological concept with the fallen state of humans that we inherited from Adam, which is innate corruption and inclination towards sin, right? Now, so, and it went on to say that, based on theology, these are inseparably linked. Inherited sin is the root causal condition for sin. So we went back and forth about this. So I said, yes, we are in an agreement on both points. A strict literal reading of the single verse that praises them would suggest they were not biblical lawbreakers after the birth of their son John. That's a fact. Let me read it again. Even AI agreed that there is agreement theologically on both points. One, there is a strict literal reading of a single verse that praises them would suggest they were not biblical lawbreakers after the birth of their son. And the concept of sin is dual. It's both transgression of the law, actual sin, and an inherited condition of a sinful nature or an original sin. And that's, so I said we've gotten to the point. Yes, we have. Right? And so that, basically, I'm going to stop there. Right? So the AI did then agree with me, you see, that these were not biblical lawbreakers and therefore not sinners according to the law. Because sin is, in the Bible is called a breaking of the law. Zacharias and Elizabeth never broke the law after the birth of their son John. You see? So they were not considered sinners and were held in high regard. Even to this day, that's why they're written in the Bible. Right? The only thing that we apply to them when it comes to sin is the concept of, because it says sin is dual, right? The inherited nature of the original sin, right? We attribute original sin to them, you see, which is a metaphysical concept. So you could say, yes, they were sinners under the original sin, and that could be correct. But you could also say they under the biblical law, they were not sinners and they did not break any laws, which would lead to them being called sinners. That's also correct. So there are 2 points here that you have to understand, right? Metaphysically, human beings are subject to a so-called concept of original sin. But Zacharias and his wife were not sinners according to the Bible, according to the scripture. They were not breakers of biblical law. And it said even God held them in a high regard, right? You see? It said, they were held, it says God, they were righteous before God, walking in commandments and ordinances of the Lord, considered blameless. You see? And so I just want to go over that because of I think it was just a teachable moment, and I think it's interesting. And I think that because people, if people say you're a sinner, and technically, no, you're not. You're not a sinner. The concept of original sin is something theologically, metaphysically, you can't do anything about. You see, from a theological standpoint. That's the concept of original sin from Adam. That's not something you can see. What you can see outwardly is breaking the law. That's sin. You see? And so if you don't break the laws of the statutes and commandments and follow the prophecies, then you're not considered a sinner. You're not a sinner. Right? It's the hopeless sinner, right? You're not a hopeless sinner. Does the concept of original sin still apply to you? Theologically, yes. That would be yes. Are you a sinner? No, you're not. I don't. That depends on whether you're breaking the law or not. Because you're given, theologically, God gives you grace for the original sin. You see? But only if you keep the law. So you're given grace for the original sin if you keep the law, like Zacharias and Elizabeth. So it cancels it out. You're not punished, as they say. It's almost moot. It's a moot point if you keep the law, because the law then what? Makes you perfect, not a sinner, and then gives you grace of God, as they say, where you're not held accountable for original sin and punished for it. You see? But metaphysically, you only get out of original, you only get the, let's say, the get out of jail free card on the original sin by keeping the law, which then makes you not a sinner. You see? And so in the eyes of man, you can't be called, a man cannot call you a sinner. A man, like the people last night I was in a debate with, they may say, well, the original sin applies to you. Yeah, it does. Are you a sinner? No, I'm not. I'm not a sinner. I don't break the laws of God. You see? I don't knowingly break the laws of God or break the laws of God. I try to keep my lifestyle within the laws, written. Right? And so therefore I wouldn't be considered a sinner. You only a sinner if you willingly, knowingly break the laws as they're written in the Bible, the 613 laws. You don't believe in a prophecy, then you are a sinner. Like, so there was a gentleman, he wanted to argue with me that Christ did away with the Old Testament. And I said, you're a fool. I said, Christ, and I tried to tell him, and he then repeated what I said and answered his own question. And prove what I was saying. He said, Christ did away with, well, what he said was wrong. He said Christ did away with the sacrificial laws, therefore he did away with the whole Old Testament. That is incorrect. The reformations of so-called Jesus Christ never did away with the whole Old Testament. It only did away with the ceremonial sacrificial laws. And I agreed with him, but because he was so ignorant, he couldn't take that point. You see? He kept saying, no, the whole Old Testament is done away with. And I said, no, you're wrong. The Old Testament and Christ never reformed the whole Old Testament and got rid of it. That's incorrect. And many Christians, so-called westernized, colonized Christians, make that mistake, right? Particularly non-Israelites or colonized minds, Christians, they'll make that kind of mistake. Just like Christ, the Old Testament doesn't exist anymore. It's only the New Testament, which is foolishness if you read the Bible. That's foolishness. Because there are many end times prophecies in the Old Testament. So if the end time that means you're gonna. How the hell would you understand end time prophecy if you get rid of the end time prophecies? So that doesn't make sense. And Ezra, right? And things like that. And Ezra and Joel, these are end time prophecies. So I tried to explain that he couldn't get it. I said, he called me a dickhead. I said, you're stupid. If you think it's not written anywhere in the book that he got rid of the Old Testament. Only certain aspects were gotten rid of. He couldn't get it. So, you know, you have to, like me, I'm taking a nuanced approach to this. I'm not saying that they were not subject to the original sin. That's not what I'm saying. So if you wanted to look at it as them being sinners under the original sin, yes, you could say that, right? It's a nuanced approach. But if you read it, it strictly says that they were not sinners under biblical law. And those two things you have to, it's a nuanced approach. It's a sophisticated approach. And you have to understand that there are 2 points to sin, not just one, if you're going to say that. And both are correct. It is a correct statement according to the record to say Zacharias and Elizabeth were not sinners according to biblical law. Were they subject to the original sin? Yes. Did it affect their relationship with God, their position in the community? No, it did not. Why? Because by the grace of God, the original sin was not in effect. Right? By God's grace, as they say, they were not punished, being held accountable for that. Why? Because they kept the law. You see, it's a transaction. And both things are part of that transaction. You can't have one without the other. So you do have original sin. It does not automatically make you a sinner, you see, because of the situation of grace, the transaction of grace of God, if you keep the law and are not a sinner on the other side of that. You see? And so when I told them, I said, no, these two people were considered blameless, sinless. Well, sinless, blameless doesn't mean sinless, but they were considered sinless because they didn't break law. And sin is the breaking of the law according to the Bible, not just original sin. But by doing that, by keeping the law, and then they got God's grace. So the original sin was not in effect, was of no effect to them. You see how that works? It's very circular. It's a circular exchange. The only way to get away from the original, not be a sinner and not be held account as an original, on the original sin, which you are, it's part of the dynamic, but it's not the whole story, is to keep the law. Now, once you don't keep the law, okay, now you're subject to original sin. You've broken the law and sin, and so now you're a full throttle, full blown fucking sinner. Right? Feet on the gas, hands in the air sinner. There is no grace of God to absolve the so-called original sin, to shield you from the original and absolve the original sin. There is no grace there. Why? Because you broke the laws. So you're a full throttle sinner at that point. The transaction, you have failed in the transaction, I guess. You come short in the transaction. So now you get the judgment of the original sin and breaking the law, and therefore you are a sinner. Yes. Yes, you are a sinner and you are held in full account. So hopefully that makes sense, right? That's a little reading of Luke 1 and 6. So that's all I got for now.